Happy Easter. I almost feel bad doing this after a song like that, but what do you call a really well-dressed, immaculately groomed, kind of prissy lion? A dandelion. But I'm back. Okay. So Easter obviously is right up there with Christmas as far as important Christian holidays. I will tell you, you're going to get a very unconventional take from me on this topic. I was raised in a very heavy-handed, mostly Southern Baptist type of Christianity that honestly did a lot of damage. And the Easter story in that tradition is really all about the literal crucifixion, torture, all that stuff, and then rising up from the dead of Jesus, who is seen as the Christ, the one and only Christ. Now, as a little kid, this was a weird holiday for me, because I was like, I liked the Easter eggs, I liked the chocolate bunnies, but the whole torture and thorns thing was not so good for me. And I would be thinking, I'd be going along slurping on my candy, and I'd be thinking, okay, if there's an all-loving, all-powerful God, how can he send his only kid to be tortured and die? It's like, that just doesn't make any sense. And then I'd be like, okay, slurp, slurp, let's go find another egg. That was kind of my take to it. Now that I'm an adult, at least mostly, I've actually come to really love the symbolism of Easter. I think it's far less about the crucifixion and far more about our own individual journeys of rising up, and rising up. And before I get into some of that symbolism, I want to give you a little fun history on this holiday. So it turns out Easter is the only Christian holiday that's tied to the cycles of the moon. So this is why its dates change. Back in the year 3025, a bunch of bishops were called together by the Roman emperor, got them together. It was called the First Council of Nicaea, and they basically laid out what the laws of Christianity were going to be, including, in that very first council, decreeing that Easter would be observed on the first Sunday following the first full moon after spring equinox. Now, and again, that's why our dates vary a little bit. Now, there's a lot of history to show that early Christians had a real interest in trying to sort of take over many of the pre-Christian pathways, religious pathways and spiritual pathways, indigenous ways of belief, Druidism, what have you. And I think it's really fun to become aware of how much pagan symbolism still exists within these Christian holidays. So there's some line of thinking that the actual name Easter, and probably not going to pronounce this correctly, but comes from Ostre, or Ostra, and that's the Anglo-Saxon goddess of spring and fertility. And in fact, if you think about Easter's symbolism, eggs, bunnies, it's kind of racy. It's kind of all about fertility, really. Yeah, don't get too excited. I got one more. Speaking of the Easter bunny, what's the Easter bunny's favorite workout? Exercise. My friend Marilyn gave me that just a couple days ago. I think, to get a little more substantive here, I think it's perfect that Easter falls in springtime. It is a time of renewal. And even here in our high desert, it's still chilly out there, but you can just see the light is different, right? We actually have dandelions growing in the parking lot. And by the way, it's good to let dandelions grow this time of year because they're one of the very first flowers that bloom. And when the bees, like my bees in my hive, when they start coming out as it gets warmer, they can get food there. They're not, one man's weed is another bee's nectar, I guess we could say. So one of the really many tremendous benefits of the whole journey of becoming a unity minister is being able to unlearn and reclaim and reframe a lot of the Christian teachings and a lot of these stories, and to pull the wisdom from them. Now, on Easter, the story of Jesus is a really important story. And I want to put forward that Unity does not view Jesus as an unattainable exception. We do not believe that Christ is Jesus' last name. We believe rather that he was an extraordinary human who so fully remembered and woke up to what he was as a spiritual being beyond just a body, that he became unified with the divine. The Christ consciousness is available to everyone. He is just a person who happened to activate and embody it to such a degree that Unity puts him forward not as an unattainable exception, but as an exceptional example for what we all can tap into. Jesus never ever said, "Worship me." He said, "Follow me, because I have found something awesome, and you can too." Right? That's really what these teachings are about. Now, I have to touch on this whole sin thing. I may be off-putting to some of you, but I think the concept of original sin is one of the most damaging psychological things ever done to human beings. I think we're all original blessings, and then our parents get a hold of us, right? And we start layering on our crud, and then we got to unlearn some things over time. Through Unity, I learned that sin actually comes from an archery term that means missing the mark. That's what we're talking about here. I also have to talk about this concept of atonement, because in, again, the Christianity of my youth, we were taught that all of us were so awful and bad from the get-go that God had to have Jesus killed to atone for our sins. I think that is horsepucky. I think that's an awful, awful tale. I prefer the word at-one-ment. That's how I say that word. And I think atonement is really what Jesus demonstrated when he remembered. He came back to the fullness of his identity, his self with a capital S. Now, one aspect of this Bible Easter story that I have come to find really quite touching now is the Garden of Gethsemane. And in this, Jesus, he knows what's coming. And he has gone, this is the night before he's arrested, he has gone to the garden with several of his closest friends called disciples in the Bible. And he's nervous. He knew that he was in really, really deep. And he goes in there and he has a moment of human weakness, and he prays 3 times. His word for God was Father. When he says Father, he was stepping into the consciousness of oneness. And 3 times he says, "Father, if there is any other way, please take this cup from me." Who wouldn't be afraid, right? Crucifixion was a common thing back then. You'd see him all along lining streets and things. He knew what was coming. Now, I want to take a moment and just consider even the word crucifixion. It's a scary sounding word, at least to me. And there's no doubt that many times in our lives, we do face actual persecution, if not crucifixion. People do us harm. They do us wrongs, right? They do cause problems, but I now know they cause us problems. I now know we are the only ones who can actually crucify ourselves. That song that was sung, shame is what was putting him in the grave. Fear was the crucifixion there, right? It's when we rise up out of those kinds of limiting self-beliefs. A Course in Miracles says that thoughts like that, feeling shame, feeling self-doubt, feeling like I'm not good enough, I don't have enough, that those are attack thoughts that we level against ourselves. I think that the idea, probably, of a sacrificial atonement is kind of cool, because then it takes the responsibility off ourselves, right? Then we don't have to ferret out and heal that unhealthy thinking if we can just trust that that dude died for us and so it's gone. New Thought doesn't work like that. New Thought is about responsibility with our spirituality. I want to read you just a couple of clips from a classic, Eric Butterworth's Discover the Power Within You. This book is so well used, you can see it. It's scotch taped the cover on here. So Butterworth is talking a little bit about the Beatitudes, which was one of Jesus's biggest teaching, Sermon on the Mount, blessed are they who are meek, etc., etc. He talks about this one. There's a deeper and more meaningful application of this beatitude, which is the beatitude of blessed are they who are persecuted, right? The emphasis is on attitudes. It deals with our thinking. The persecution takes place within our mind, and the persecutor is an errant thought of our own mind. Whenever you set a course of righteousness or right thinking, when you begin a program of discipline and self-restraint, you'll invariably run into the cross currents of your own static thoughts. In physics, to move something that is still or to stop something that is in motion, you must overcome inertia. The inertial force holds a thing in rest or in motion until it is acted upon by an external force. There is a kind of mental inertia within all of us that resists change. For even the effort to improve your life will necessitate coming to grips with the states of mind that have directed the kind of life you're now experiencing. Right? There's a form of crucifixion that comes even when we stay stuck. When we know we need to make that step and it's just a little too hard to do so. So, back to the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus is there. He knows bad stuff is coming down. He asks his dear friends, the disciples, to stay awake with him. They don't. He starts praying. They fall asleep. He had to have felt betrayed in that moment too, right? Knowing what he was up against. They fell asleep. Sometimes when facing something really hard, it's kind of easier just to try to sleepwalk through it, right? Beautiful imagery in that scene. And Jesus is scared, and remember, just not too far earlier, he was kind of pleading with God, please take this plot, take this thing away from me, it's too hard. And then he remembers himself, and he comes back and he says, no, not my will, but thine. Thy will be done. And in that moment, I believe what Jesus was saying is, I'm not going to get out of this in the human form. I know that this is going to be a big thing, a very difficult thing. But I also know that I'm more than this, and I am here for greatness. I am here for something more. And at the level of absolute truth, I cannot be killed. I cannot be crucified. And that was really one of his main lessons for us, was that level of faith, not only in source, oneness, creator, but faith in himself. Faith in, I know I am more than just this. That's what I sure am aspiring to. There's another practical tool that is demonstrated in that story, and it is the spiritualized version of will. I have given whole talks on this. I have had quite a evolution in my thinking about will and free will and God's will. And I have come to the point now where when I am in a place of oneness, when you are in a place of oneness, God's will is your will. You are an extension. You are an extension of creation, an extension of the Creator. The Creator would not want ill for itself, and it doesn't want it for us either. And I'll tell you how that I sometimes practically use this. I mentioned in celebrations that I was on this big road trip for the dog agility thing. I have been in a lot of countries, a lot of places. This was the sketchiest motel I have ever been in. I should have known when I had reserved it cheap on hotels.com, and I pulled up and it said 1 week for $199. And I got way too into the little cheap self. So I get it. It's the first place I've ever had to clean my room myself before I would bring my stuff in. I could have pushed it open with the lock with one hand, I'm sure. And there was all kinds of stuff going on in that parking lot. And a lot of the people who didn't look a lot like me. And I just had, Joanne Pasmore, who is one of our main members here, she once shared a little piece of wisdom with me. It's have faith and tie up your camel. So every evening when I would come in, I'd take all my valuables out of my car, I'd open up the glove box and the console, it's all like that. Well, Olive, my dog, and I had just gotten back from the fairgrounds. I think it was on where the event was. I think it was on day 3. It was still kind of light out, and I'm putting my stuff on the bed and getting ready, and I look up, and there's a man looking in the window. And I just instinctively, I went, "Hey!" Olive goes, "Rah!" Like that. That guy jumped like he had been hit with an electric cattle prod. In retrospect, it was so funny, but man, for a second, my heart was in my throat, right? And then I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm being cased. And then I was just kind of like, God's will is not for me to get robbed here. My car's been fine for 3 days. That guy was more scared than I was. He was actually kind of a middle-aged, when I thought about it, kind of middle-aged, kind of dapper black man. He probably was just curious. I don't know. Nothing ever happened. But that's a practical application of, I could have probably moved rooms. I didn't want to. So at that point, I'm going to pull in. My will is that everything is perfect and fine here, and that I am fine and that man is fine. That's exactly what came down. How many times have you found yourself facing an ordeal and wanting to have it taken from you? How many times have you known you need to make a move, but you're having trouble finding the courage? Are you holding on to old stories about your past? Do you have a need to continue to be identified as a victim of your past? I think that's way more prevalent than people think. It was in my life. It took a lot for me to really awaken to how strongly I had been tied to certain stories about things that had been done to me. Here's another practical tool. I could tell, so some of you will know, I had my life blow up in big catastrophic fashion about a decade ago. I could say, got taken down in a horrible public shaming, lost my business, just about destroyed our family, had to go to bankruptcy, blah, blah. That's true. I could also say, life hit me with something that I did not see coming. It was hard. I decided to treat it like a spiritual sabbatical. I did a lot of in-depth, even EMDR counseling. I started down the path to becoming a unity minister, and I wrote a book. That's all true, too. Which is more empowering? I think this is part of the resurrection. Sometimes we need not to resurrect the old stories, right? But to tell ourselves, to rise up above those old stories and tell ourselves a more empowering truth. That's the practical tool number 2 that I would share. Unity is known for a metaphysical take on the Bible. It doesn't treat the Bible as literal fact, but rather as profound stories that have metaphysical meaning to them. Now, I found this interesting. I did a little bit of research for y'all. The actual meaning of Gethsemane in Hebrew, is oil press. And indeed, it was a garden near an oil grove. I'm going to come back to that. Metaphysically, Gethsemane represents the struggle that takes place within our consciousness. Think about Jesus going back and forth, right? Gosh, don't make me do this. Okay, your will, not mine. It's the struggle that happens in our consciousness as we realize that we need to release old aspects of ourselves, our identities, our beliefs, the habits that we can no longer ignore because we know they're not in alignment with us. This is the metaphysical meaning of Gethsemane, and it can often be quite challenging. Now, a press, as in an oil press, that's an emblem of trial or distress, right? Think pressure, you're being pressured. But what comes out in the oil is all the good stuff. You squeeze out, that pressure squeezes out the excess, the stuff you don't want. Oil is a symbol for spiritual illumination. I think this is really the great work before each and every one of us who, for whatever reason, whatever way, we've come into these human parts of the journey. It's all about the resurrection. And in the Course in Miracles group earlier this week, got a couple of my main homies are here today, who shared something really cool, that resurrection itself is kind of a weird word. And maybe a better word is awakening or even remembering, right? It's coming up, it's rising up into the consciousness of our true selves. A Course in Miracles says, resurrection must compel your allegiance gladly, because it is the symbol of joy. Its whole compelling power lies in the fact that it represents what you want to be. The freedom to leave behind everything that hurts you and humbles you and frightens you cannot be thrust upon you, but it can be offered you through the grace of God, Source, Creator. Friends, Easter is not about the crucifixion. It's not about the jabbing of spears or the thorns, whether someone else has given them to you or you're giving them to yourself. It's not about that. It is about the remembering the allness, the truth of who you are. Your rising up is absolutely glorious. When we are aligned with our true selves, our highest selves, we hear remnants of an ancient song. You can kind of catch it. You kind of remember it. Have you had those experiences? You can kind of sense a truth is dancing right here on the edge of your consciousness. Those are the moments when we are rising up. That is what we can harness right now in this Easter time. It is a joyous song. This is your very Easter time. Every single moment that you choose for it to be. Rise up. Namaste.